I don't think I'll ever go camping again. Not after what happened last summer. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me and the quiet of nature for a few days. I had planned everything, checked my gear twice, and drove out to a secluded spot deep in the forest, miles away from any towns or main roads. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent near a small clearing, close to a stream where I could collect water. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows through the dense foliage. The air was cool, crisp, and filled with the usual sounds of nature. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, letting my mind drift. I didn't realize it then, but something felt off. Not in a supernatural way, but in a way that made my skin itch. I chalked it up to my city instincts kicking in. I wasn't used to being alone in the wild like this. It wasn't until I crawled into my tent and turned off my flashlight that the unease crept in deeper. The forest had gone silent, completely silent. No insects, no wind, no movement. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but my body knew something wasn't right. I lay awake for what felt like hours, listening. I wanted to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it, soft footsteps. Slow, deliberate, maybe 20 feet from my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. It could have been an animal, but these steps were too precise, too human. I reached for my knife, my fingers wrapping tightly around the handle. I listened as the steps circled my tent once, twice. Then they stopped. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. My tent walls were thin, and I knew that whatever or whoever was out there, they were close enough to hear me breathing. I waited, barely daring to move. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the woods. I stayed awake until the first hint of sunlight touched my tent, only then allowing myself to doze off for a couple of hours. When I finally crawled out, everything looked normal. No tracks, no signs of disturbance. Maybe I had imagined it. I spent the next day hiking, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. I followed a narrow game trail deeper into the woods, marking my path carefully so I wouldn't get lost. The uneasiness still lingered, but I told myself it was just nerves. Then, as I was making my way back to camp, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A single boot print, deep, fresh. It wasn't mine. It was facing toward my camp. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Someone had been out here, someone who wasn't supposed to be. I picked up my pace, eyes scanning the trees. Every shadow, every movement in the corner of my vision made my nerves snap. By the time I reached my campsite, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool air. Everything looked the same, nothing seemed disturbed. But then I noticed my tent flap. It was slightly open. I was sure I had zipped it closed before leaving. I stepped forward cautiously, knife in hand, and pushed the flap wider. My sleeping bag was in its usual spot. My gear was untouched, but my backpack, it had been moved, just a few inches. Enough for me to know for certain that someone had been inside my tent. Panic kicked in, but I forced myself to stay calm. If someone had been watching me, they'd know I was alone. They'd know I was vulnerable. Staying another night wasn't an option. I needed to leave. Now, I shoved my gear into my pack as fast as I could. The sun was already low, and I cursed myself for not leaving earlier. The nearest road was a few miles away, and I'd have to move fast. I doused the fire, double-checked my knife, and started hiking back toward my truck. The woods felt different now, less like a peaceful retreat, more like a trap. Every step I took, I expected to hear footsteps behind me. Every gust of wind made me flinch. The trees closed in, the dimming light twisting their branches into claw-like shapes. My mind screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running meant noise. Noise meant attention. Then I smelled it. Smoke, not from my fire. This was different, stronger, thicker. It was coming from up ahead, near the direction of my truck. My stomach twisted. I slowed my pace, moving carefully, silently. As I crested a small hill, I saw it, my truck, parked at the edge of the dirt road, right where I had left it, and standing next to it, a man. He was dressed in dark, tattered clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at my truck. My heart pounded. Then he turned. Even from a distance, I could see the way his head cocked slightly, as if he was listening. And then, without a word, he stepped back into the woods and disappeared. I didn't wait. I sprinted to my truck, my legs burning. When I reached it, my hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The second the engine roared to life, I slammed the door shut, locked it, and floored it down the dirt road, kicking up dust and gravel behind me. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away, back on the main highway, surrounded by the dull glow of streetlights. Only then did I finally breathe. I never found out who he was, never found out what he wanted. But I knew one thing for sure: he had been watching me. Maybe from the moment I set up camp. Maybe even before that. I haven't been camping since. I always loved camping. The quiet of the woods, the crackling of the fire, the way the night air felt cool against my skin. It was the only place where I ever truly felt at peace. But after that trip, I can't step into the woods without feeling like something is watching me. I don't think I'll ever go back. It was late October when I decided to head out alone. I had done solo trips before and never had a problem. I planned everything perfectly. Packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, and extra batteries. I even carried a flare gun and a hunting knife just in case. I chose a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. I wanted real isolation. I arrived at the site in the early afternoon. The trees were mostly bare, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. Dry leaves crunched under my boots as I hiked in, my backpack heavy against my shoulders. I walked for about 2 hours before I found the perfect clearing: flat ground, a nearby stream for water, and just enough tree cover to block the wind. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and made a small fire as the sun began to set. As darkness fell, the forest became eerily silent. The usual sounds of chirping insects and distant owls were gone. Felt wrong, but I ignored it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I ate my dinner, warmed my hands by the fire, and decided to turn in early. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a slow wake-up either. 1 second, I was asleep. The next, I was wide awake, heart pounding, ears straining. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint shadows against the thin fabric of my tent. I listened. Nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it, a crunch. Leaves, twigs, something moving just beyond my campsite. It wasn't an animal. Animals move quickly, rustling through the brush, sniffing around. This was deliberate, slow. Someone, or something, was stepping carefully, as if trying not to be heard. I held my breath. My knife was within reach, but I didn't grab it. Not yet. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a coyote, but deep down I knew better. Minutes passed. The sound stopped. I waited, muscles tense. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that I had imagined it, something brushed against my tent. It was light, barely more than a whisper, but it was real. I froze, my skin crawling. The fabric shifted slightly, like fingers running across it. I didn't move, couldn't. My body refused to respond. My ears strained for more sounds, but there was only silence. Then nothing. Whatever it was gone. I stayed awake for hours, gripping my knife, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyes grew heavy, my mind dulled, and I slipped into uneasy sleep. Morning came with a dull gray sky. I stepped out of my tent, rubbing my arms against the chill. The forest looked the same, normal, but the feeling hadn't left me. I circled my campsite, looking for tracks. Nothing, not even deer prints. The ground was disturbed, though. Some leaves had been brushed aside, almost as if something had been dragged. I told myself it was paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I debated packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. Maybe it really had just been my imagination. I forced breakfast down, took a short hike to clear my head, and tried to relax. The day passed uneventfully, but as night fell, the dread returned. I built my fire larger this time, keeping my knife close. I sat with my back against a tree, watching the flames, listening to the forest. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Not footsteps, not brushing against my tent. Breathing, soft, slow, close, right behind me. I didn't turn around, couldn't. I was frozen, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then suddenly it stopped. I spun around. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The fire flickered, casting shadows. My breath came in short gasps. My mind screamed at me to run, to pack up and get the hell out. But I stayed. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Not mine. Bare footprints. Human. They circled my campsite, and they led into the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. I packed up in record time. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I just grabbed my gear and started hiking back, moving fast, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig sent a spike of fear through me. I reached my car just as the sun began to set. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sped off down the dirt road. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone. I was supposed to be out there for 3 nights. Just me, my tent, and the endless quiet of the forest. I had been planning this trip for weeks, carefully choosing a remote spot deep in the woods where I wouldn't see another soul. No trails, no campgrounds, just untouched wilderness. That was the whole point, to get away, to clear my head. The first day went fine. I hiked in early, setting up camp about 5 miles from where I'd parked my truck. I picked a spot by a small creek, surrounded by thick trees. It was peaceful, isolated, exactly what I wanted. I spent the day exploring, gathering firewood, and making sure I had enough supplies. By nightfall, I had a fire going. I ate, read a little by flashlight, then lay back in my tent listening to the sounds of the forest. There were the usual noises, branches shifting, insects buzzing, the occasional rustling of small animals. Normal, expected. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something different. A snapping sound, like a branch breaking underfoot. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Maybe 100 yards out. I held my breath, listening. Then another snap, and then silence. I sat up, heart pounding. I wasn't scared yet, just alert. I told myself it was probably a deer moving through the trees, maybe a bear. I had my knife, a small hatchet, and bear spray. I wasn't defenseless. The sound didn't come back, so after a while, I lay back down. Eventually, I slept. The next day, I woke up early and decided to check the area where I'd heard the noises. I didn't find much, just some disturbed leaves, maybe a few broken twigs. Nothing obvious. I spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, making sure to mark my way so I wouldn't get lost. The more I explored, the more I started to notice something strange. I hadn't seen any other campers, which wasn't surprising given how remote the area was. But I also hadn't seen much wildlife. No deer, no squirrels, not even many birds. The forest felt off, too quiet. That night, I made my fire bigger. I don't know why. Something about the silence unsettled me. I kept my hatchet close. I ate, listened again to the sounds of the woods, and tried to push the unease away. Around midnight, I woke up again. A sound had pulled me from sleep. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not heavy enough to be a bear, but too steady to be an animal. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps circled my camp, just outside the fire's dying glow. I could hear them crunching through leaves, pausing now and then like whoever or whatever it was listening. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming it into the trees. Nothing, just darkness. The The footsteps had stopped the second I turned on the light. I waited, heart hammering in my chest. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I convinced myself it was my imagination. That maybe I had dreamed it, half asleep and paranoid. I told myself that, but I didn't turn the flashlight off for a long time. The third day, I debated leaving early. My supplies would last, and I wasn't in any real danger, but the feeling of being watched, of something being just out of sight, was gnawing at me. By afternoon, I had almost convinced myself to stay. But then I found something. Just beyond the tree line, maybe 20 yards from my camp, I saw something hanging from a low branch. A piece of rope, frayed at the edges, tied into a loop. A noose. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of that. I stood there staring at it, my stomach twisting into a knot. It wasn't old. The rope looked fresh, like it had been put there recently. Someone had been near my camp. Someone had left that there. I packed up in under 10 minutes. I didn't care about food or water, just the essentials. I kept my knife in my hand the whole time. The hike back to my truck felt longer than it should have. Every few minutes I stopped, listening. I didn't hear footsteps this time, but I felt something. That same weight of being watched. My skin crawled with it. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't look back. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the narrow dirt road that led out of the woods, my headlights caught something in the trees. A figure, just for a second, standing between the trees, half hidden by the shadows. Too tall to be an animal. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I hit the main road, not daring to check my mirrors. I never went back. I don't know who was out there or why they were watching me, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to leave that forest. I don't know why I ignored the uneasy feeling when I first got there. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long drive or just the excitement of finally being away from everything. I had been planning this trip for months. 3 days of solo camping deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. I wanted isolation, peace, and a break from the noise of life. I picked a remote location in a national forest, one that wasn't a popular camping site. No marked trails, no nearby campsites. Just me, my tent, and nature. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, stretching the shadows of the towering trees. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, a scent that always brought me comfort. I parked my truck at the end of a dirt road, packed my gear, and hiked in about 2 miles. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of cars, no people talking, just the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I found a clearing near a small creek and decided it was perfect. The area was flat, surrounded by thick trees, and had enough space for my tent and a fire. I set up quickly, pitching my tent and stacking some firewood before the sun dipped too low. As I worked, I had the strange feeling of being watched, but every time I stopped and looked around, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. I chalked it up to nerves. Being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind. That night, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and enjoying the silence. The stars were bright, clearer than I had seen in a long time. It was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were too quiet. Normally, you'd hear the sounds of insects, maybe an owl or the distant howl of a coyote, but there was nothing, just silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to ignore it and went to bed. My tent was sturdy, my gear was good, and I had a knife and a small hatchet with me. There was nothing to be afraid of. But that night, I didn't sleep well. Every little noise had me on edge. Twigs snapping, rustling leaves. I told myself it was just the wind or small animals moving around. But deep down, I felt something was wrong. The next morning, I found footprints near my camp. They weren't mine. They were fresh, slightly sunken in the damp earth. And they were barefoot. I stared at them for a long time, my mind trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe another camper? But who hikes out here barefoot? And why so close to my tent? I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. I spent the day exploring, trying to enjoy the trip despite the lingering unease. I hiked for a few hours, following the creek, taking photos, and trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. When I returned to camp in the late afternoon, I checked my supplies. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed. Maybe I had just imagined the footprints. That night, I built my fire bigger, the flickering light making the darkness seem less threatening. I sat with my back to my tent, facing the woods, watching, listening. And that's when I saw it. Movement, a shape shifting between the trees, just at the edge of the firelight. It was quick, disappearing before I could focus on it. I stood up, gripping my hatchet, my heart pounding. "Hello!" I called out, even though I knew better. No answer, just the silence of the forest, heavy and unnatural. I forced myself to sit back down, pretending I wasn't scared, but my eyes stayed locked on the tree-line. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, dozing off in short, restless bursts. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd wake up to the feeling of something watching me. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. The trip wasn't worth the paranoia, and I had no desire to find out who or what was out there with me. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my backpack. But as I turned to grab my tent, I stopped cold. The entrance was unzipped. I knew for a fact I had zipped it up before going to bed. My stomach dropped. I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I pulled back the flap. Inside, my sleeping bag was unrolled, and next to it, right in the center of the tent, was a single dirty footprint. I left everything behind. I grabbed my backpack, my hatchet, and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran until I reached my truck. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the keys in the ignition. The moment the engine roared to life, I sped off, not caring about the rough road or the branches scraping against my truck. I never went back for my gear. Whatever was out there, whoever had been watching me, they could have it. I didn't care. I just knew I was never camping alone again. To this day, I don't know who it was. A hermit? A lost hiker? Someone who lived in the woods and didn't want me there? I'll never know. And I don't want to, because the scariest thing wasn't that someone had been watching me. It was that they had been close enough to touch me, close enough to unzip my tent while I slept. And I never even heard them. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from everything. Work, my phone, the noise of the city. Just me, my gear, and the woods. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, miles away from any designated campgrounds. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The drive out was long, most of it on winding dirt roads that my truck barely managed. The trees got thicker the deeper I went, and soon, I couldn't see anything beyond the narrow trail ahead. Eventually, I reached a small clearing near a creek, exactly what I had been looking for. I parked, took a deep breath, and just listened. Nothing but the wind through the trees and the distant sound of water. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and checked my supplies. Everything was in order. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring. The forest was dense, with towering pines and thick undergrowth. It was easy to see how someone could get lost out here. The sun started dipping behind the trees, so I headed back, started a fire, and cooked some food. It was peaceful, until I heard something. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling from the trees beyond my camp. Could have been anything, a deer, maybe a raccoon. I ignored it, but then it happened again, closer this time. The fire crackled, and I stared out into the darkness, waiting. Nothing, just the forest settling, I told myself. I crawled into my tent and zipped up my sleeping bag. The forest was alive with sounds. Crickets, distant hoots of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. Normal. I closed my eyes. Then I heard footsteps. Not an animal. Something heavy. Slow, deliberate steps crunching the dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I stayed completely still. My heart was hammering. Was it a bear? Person? I reached for the knife I always kept next to me when camping. Silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then the footsteps moved away, back into the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came and I stepped out cautiously. Nothing seemed out of place. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. Maybe I imagined it. Lack of sleep playing tricks on me. I shook it off and spent the day fishing at the creek, trying to relax. That evening, as the sun set, I made sure to keep my fire bigger, just in case. I ate, sat back, and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful again. But then I smelled something. Rot. Faint at first, then stronger. A sickly, decaying stench coming from somewhere nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area. My beam landed on something in the distance. A deer or what was left of one. His body torn open, ribs exposed, flesh dark and rotting. Something killed it recently. I wasn't alone out here. I went back to my camp and kept my knife close. The fire crackled. The darkness beyond it felt heavier than before. I sat awake for hours, listening. Then, the footsteps returned. They were closer this time, circling my camp. Slow, deliberate. I gripped my knife so tightly my hand hurt. I wanted to call out, to scare whoever or whatever was away. But something told me to stay quiet. The steps stopped. A long pause. Then, something exhaled. A deep, wheezing breath just beyond the light of my fire. I couldn't see it. My flashlight barely cut through the trees. I pointed it towards the sound, and the second the beam hit the trees, the footsteps bolted away, crashing through the underbrush. Fast. Way too fast. I didn't wait until morning. I threw everything into my truck and got the hell out. The drive back was a blur, my heart pounding the entire way. I didn't look in my rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if something was following me. I never went back to that forest. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I never thought a simple camping trip could change the way I look at the woods forever. I've always loved the outdoors. Ever since I was a kid, there's something about the quiet, the isolation, and the fresh air that always made me feel at peace. But this trip was different. This trip made me realize that sometimes being alone in the woods isn't peaceful at all. Sometimes it's the most terrifying thing you could ever experience. I had planned the trip for weeks. I wanted to go deep into the forest, away from the usual camping spots filled with noisy families and groups of hikers. I wanted true solitude. I found an area on a map that seemed perfect, a dense patch of forest miles away from any main trails. It was exactly what I was looking for. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, plenty of food and water, a good knife, a first aid kit, and my trusty flashlight. Everything I needed to be self-sufficient for a few nights. The drive was long, and the road turned from asphalt to dirt the farther I went. Eventually, I reached the point where I had to park my truck and continue on foot. I strapped on my backpack and started hiking. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it became. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. The only sounds were my boots crunching the undergrowth and the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt exactly like I had hoped, completely cut off from the world. After a few hours of hiking, I found a spot that seemed perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a slight incline that would keep rainwater from pooling around my tent. I set up camp quickly. The sun was still high, but I knew the light would fade soon. I gathered some firewood, set up my sleeping bag inside the tent, and made sure my food was stored properly. As the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped fast. I lit a fire and cooked a simple meal. The flickering flames cast long shadows across the clearing, making the trees look like dark figures standing just beyond the reach of the light. I wasn't scared, though. I had camped alone before, and I knew the woods were full of harmless noises. Branches snapping from animals, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I told myself that every sound I heard was just nature doing its thing. But as the night went on, something felt off. The usual nighttime sounds seemed distant, muted. The woods were too quiet. Normally, you'd hear the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of a small animal in the underbrush. but there was nothing, just the soft crackling of my fire and my own breathing. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper of movement, something shifting in the trees just outside my campsite. I turned my head sharply, scanning the darkness. The firelight didn't reach far enough to see anything beyond the immediate clearing. I held my breath, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing, just silence. I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe a small animal had moved through the leaves, and I had just overreacted. I let it go. The fire burned low, and I decided it was time to sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tightly. The fabric was thin, but it gave me a sense of security. I lay there for a while, listening to the silence. Eventually, my exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard it again. A sound just outside my tent. A slow, deliberate movement. Not the scurrying of a raccoon or the soft steps of a deer. This was different. It was calculated, careful, like something was trying not to be heard. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached for my flashlight and my knife, my hands shaking slightly. I clicked the light on and aimed it at the tent walls. The thin fabric illuminated, but I saw nothing outside. I stayed still, barely breathing. Minutes passed. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe a branch had fallen, or maybe I had dreamed the noise. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, forcing myself to relax. I must have drifted off again, because the next time I woke up, it was to the feeling of cold air hitting my face. My tent door was unzipped. I bolted upright, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I shined it toward the opening. The zipper was down halfway, flapping slightly in the night breeze. I knew I had zipped it. I was sure of it. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, my heart hammering. I shined the flashlight around the clearing. Nothing, just my campfire, now burned down to glowing embers, and the endless darkness beyond. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I grabbed my knife and stood still, listening. My breath was shaky, my skin cold despite the fire's warmth. And then I heard it again, a slow, careful movement in the trees. Something was out there. I wasn't going to wait around to find out what it was. I grabbed my backpack and quickly shoved my essential gear into it. I didn't care about packing neatly, I just needed to leave. Then, just as I was about to shoulder my pack, something moved at the edge of the clearing. A figure, person. They were just standing there, barely visible between the trees. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a human shape. They weren't moving, just watching. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at them. The beam cut through the darkness, but the second the light hit the spot where they had been, they were gone. I heard movement, fast, retreating steps vanishing into the woods. I wasn't going to stick around to see if they came back. I left my tent behind. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started moving fast, keeping my flashlight aimed ahead of me. The hike back to my truck was a blur. Every few minutes, I would hear a noise behind me. Footsteps, rustling, something moving in the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. By the time I reached my truck, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I threw my pack into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on paved roads, surrounded by signs of civilization. I never went back for my tent. I never even went back to that forest. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing: I wasn't alone. I always loved camping. There was something about being out in the open, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of nature. It made me feel free, but after what happened last year, I don't think I'll ever go again. I had planned a solo camping trip for months. It was something I had done before and always enjoyed. The idea of being alone in the woods was peaceful to me. I packed my gear, double-checked my supplies, and set off for a remote area in a national forest. It was a spot I had researched thoroughly, far from any crowded campgrounds, no cell service, no people. Just me and nature. The drive there was long, about 5 hours, and the last stretch was on an old dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. My truck bounced over rocks and potholes, the trees closing in around me as I drove deeper into the forest. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, and surrounded by thick trees that made me feel completely isolated. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got everything ready for the night. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, the smell of pine strong around me. I felt completely at ease as I built my fire and started cooking a simple meal. The crackling of the flames and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds. As the night went on, I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth and the silence. That's when I first noticed it. Something felt off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. The woods were never completely silent, but at that moment they were. No rustling of leaves, no insects, nothing. Just dead silence. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination. But then I heard it. A soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves, came from the trees behind my tent. I froze, my heart pounding. I listened, straining my ears. Another crunch, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, maybe a deer? But something about the way it moved felt wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. I told myself I was being paranoid and went back to my fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself there was nothing out there. Then, another sound. This time it was different. A low, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the forest floor. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my knife, standing up slowly, scanning the trees. My fire flickered, casting shadows that danced and twisted. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound put me on edge. I stayed in my tent, knife in hand, listening. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. The birds were chirping, the sun was shining, and the fear from the night before felt like a bad dream. I forced myself to laugh it off. Maybe I was just on edge because I was alone. I spent the day hiking, fishing, and enjoying the wilderness. By the time the sun started to set, I was feeling good again. But as soon as night fell, the uneasy feeling returned. I built a bigger fire, trying to push back the darkness. As I ate my dinner, I kept glancing at the tree line. That's when I noticed something subtle, but enough to make my skin crawl. The woods didn't feel the same. It wasn't just quiet this time. It felt like something was out there, just beyond the light of my fire. I told myself I was being paranoid again, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided to stay awake for as long as I could, just in case. The fire crackled, casting flickering light across my campsite. I sat with my knife close, listening. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. The dragging sound, closer this time. My heart pounded as I gripped my knife, scanning the darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, aiming it toward the trees. Nothing. I stood there, listening, barely breathing. Then, another sound. A sharp snap like a branch breaking underfoot. It was right on the edge of my campsite now. My flashlight beam flickered as I tried to steady my shaking hands. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed by the fire, eyes locked on the darkness, waiting. When the first light of dawn appeared, I made my decision. I was leaving. I had planned to stay for 3 more nights, but something in my gut told me I needed to go. I packed my gear as fast as I could, constantly glancing at the tree line. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest felt different, heavier, like it was watching me. As I loaded my truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Not mine. They were faint but clear enough in the dirt near my campsite. Bare feet. And they weren't coming from the trail. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. They came from the trees. I slammed the truck door shut and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back one last time. My campsite was empty, the fire pit still smoldering. But something in the trees caught my eye. A shape just barely visible between the trunks. Standing still, watching. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. When I finally got back to civilization, I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone out there, and I never would be again. I was never the type to get scared easily. I had been camping all my life, deep in the woods, away from everything. There was something peaceful about being surrounded by nothing but trees, the smell of damp earth, and the crackle of a campfire. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. It started as any other trip. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out to a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains. I wanted solitude. No people, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I had planned for a week, bringing enough supplies to last. I even had a small rifle in case of wild animals, though I had never needed it before. I parked at the trailhead, checked my phone. No signal, as expected, and hiked in about 5 miles to my usual spot. It was perfect. A small clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick trees. I set up my tent, started a fire, and made dinner as the sun dipped below the treetops. The first night was uneventful. Just the sounds of the forest and the occasional rustle of leaves as some small animal moved in the darkness. I fell asleep easily. The second day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I had a GPS device, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I found a small cave, nothing too deep, and noted its location. There were animal bones near the entrance, which wasn't surprising. Predators probably used it as a den. I didn't go inside. Something about it made me uneasy. As I walked back to camp, I had the strange feeling of being watched. I stopped several times, scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I picked up my pace, gripping the rifle a little tighter. When I got back to camp, everything was as I had left it. I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my tent. A slow, deliberate movement. Not an animal. Animals don't move like that. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. My rifle was next to me, but I didn't reach for it yet. I wanted to listen. Then, something brushed against the side of my tent. I grabbed the rifle and flicked on my flashlight, unzipping the tent in one quick motion. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the fire, now just glowing embers, and the still night air. My heart pounded in my chest. I did a full circle around my camp, shining the light into the woods. Nothing. No tracks, no movement. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a falling branch. But I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I felt different, on edge, like something was just beyond my sight, watching. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up slowly, taking my time, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree line to my tent and then back into the woods. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone out here. I grabbed my rifle and started walking back toward the trailhead, fast but careful. I didn't want to run and make noise. Every so often, I stopped to listen. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me, keeping pace. I turned fast, raising my rifle. But again, there was nothing. Just trees and silence. My hands were shaking. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out here. Someone was following me. I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. I just needed to get back to my truck. I was almost there when I saw something ahead of me on the trail. A piece of fabric caught on a branch. Dark, almost black. I didn't stop to examine it. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors the second I was inside. I started the engine, my eyes scanning the tree line, and then I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the trees, watching me. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the wheel. I never reported it. What would I even say? That someone followed me? That I saw a shadow in the trees? No one would believe me, but I know what I saw. I haven't been camping since. I never thought a simple camping trip would change my life forever. It was early October, and I needed a break from the constant noise of the city. I'd always loved the outdoors, and I figured a solo camping trip would help clear my head. I picked a spot deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from any main roads, far from any towns. It was a place I had read about online, a vast stretch of wilderness with few visitors, the kind of place where you could feel truly alone. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a hunting knife, flashlight, and a small hatchet. I wasn't expecting any trouble, but I liked to be prepared. I also brought a map and compass, even though my phone had GPS service would be spotty, and I didn't want to take any chances. The drive out was long, mostly winding roads that turned into dirt paths. I parked at the trailhead, locked my truck, and started the hike to my planned campsite. It was about 6 miles in, deeper than most people would bother going. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Fallen leaves crunched beneath my boots, the only sound besides the occasional bird or rustling branch. I reached the spot by late afternoon, a small clearing beside a narrow river. It was perfect. I set up my tent, started a fire, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dipped below the treetops, the temperature dropped. I bundled up in my jacket, staring into the flames, listening to the sounds of the forest. That first night was uneventful. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the brush. I slept well, wrapped in my sleeping bag. The cold kept at bay. The second day, I explored the area, venturing further into the woods with my backpack and a knife strapped to my belt. The forest was thick, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just an eerie, pressing silence. I found signs of deer and maybe a bear, but nothing unusual. Just nature. Still, something about the quiet put me on edge. I shook it off and returned to camp before dark. That night, I heard something, a distant snapping of branches, a slow, deliberate sound, like something moving through the trees. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer wandering close to my campsite. But the noises continued, steady, slow, not the quick, erratic movements of a frightened animal. I turned off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The fire had died down to glowing embers, barely giving off any light. I listened. The sound stopped. The woods were silent again. I stayed awake for a while, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked the perimeter of my campsite. I found footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and they circled my campsite. A deep unease settled in my gut. I was miles from the nearest road, deep in the wilderness. No reason for anyone else to be here. I tried to convince myself it was a hunter, someone passing through, maybe curious about my camp. But why would they walk around my tent in the middle of the night? I considered packing up and leaving, but I had planned for 3 nights. I didn't want to scare myself into leaving early, so I stayed. That night, I kept my fire burning bright, hoping the light would keep anything or anyone away. I barely slept. At some point around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps in the trees. But this time, they didn't stop. They came closer. I held my breath, gripping my knife. I wanted to shine my flashlight, but something told me not to. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the firelight. I strained my ears, trying to hear breathing, any sound at all. Nothing. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the footsteps retreated. Slowly, carefully, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. At first light, I made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my gear as quickly as possible, every instinct screaming at me to move faster. As I was taking down my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A carving in the tree nearest my tent. Deep gouges in the bark, forming words. "Leave now." I didn't think. I just ran. I hiked back to my truck in record time, heart pounding the entire way. When I reached it, I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, not stopping until I hit the main road. I never looked back. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never go camping alone again. I remember every detail of that night in the woods, every sound, every smell, every feeling that crawled under my skin. It wasn't ghosts or demons or any of that supernatural crap that got to me. It was something real, something human, or at least something that used to be. The plan was simple: a weekend camping trip in the mountains. I had been hiking and camping for years, so this was nothing new. I packed my gear, enough food for 2 nights, and drove out to a remote location deep in the forest. I wanted solitude, away from people, from noise, from everything. Just me and nature. The hike in was peaceful. I followed a narrow dirt path that wound through thick trees, the scent of pine and damp earth filling the air. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds chirped occasionally, leaves rustled in the breeze, but it was otherwise silent. That was fine. That was what I wanted. I reached a clearing by late afternoon, a small flat space near a stream. It was perfect. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped. The fire crackled softly, its light flickering against the trees, creating long, shifting shadows. I felt at ease. That changed around midnight. I had been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up to a sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was an animal. I've camped enough to know that raccoons and other creatures sometimes come sniffing around campsites, looking for food. But this didn't sound like that. It wasn't the scurrying of small paws or the occasional rustling of leaves. It was slow, deliberate movement, heavy steps pressing into the earth. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't moving, just standing there. I reached for the knife I always kept next to my sleeping bag. My fingers tightened around the handle, but I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed. Silence. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, knife in hand, listening. The forest was dead silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. That was what scared me the most. Animals know when something's off. They go quiet when a predator is near. By the time the sun rose, I had convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a deer wandering too close. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I decided to stay another night. I don't know why. Maybe I was trying to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe I was just being stupid. I spent the day hiking, exploring the area. The forest was beautiful, untouched, wild. But the deeper I went, the more unsettled I felt. I came across a tree with deep gashes carved into its bark, like something had been clawing at it. It wasn't done with a knife. The marks were too jagged, too rough. Then I found something worse. A clearing smaller than my campsite. In the center was a pile of bones. Not animal bones. Human. I stood there, staring, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. The bones were old, weathered, some cracked and splintered. No clothing, no signs of a grave, just a pile left out in the open. I should have turned back right then. I should have packed my things and left. But I didn't. I hiked back to my campsite, trying to push the image out of my head. Maybe it was an old burial site, or remains that animals had dragged there. I tried to rationalize it, make it make sense. But a part of me knew the truth. Someone put those bones there, and they weren't meant to be found. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, there were more of them. I could hear them circling my tent, slow, deliberate. I gripped my knife, every muscle in my body tensed. I wanted to run. But where? Into the dark woods? I'd be just as blind out there as I was in my tent. Then something pressed against the fabric of the tent. A hand. I could see the outline, fingers splayed wide, pressing so hard I thought the material would tear. My breath caught in my throat. The hand stayed there for what felt like forever. Then it slid away, leaving only silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined the light outside. Nothing. Just trees, the empty campsite, the dying embers of my fire. But then I saw them. Figures, just beyond the reach of my light. Standing still, watching. Their faces were in shadow, but I could see their eyes, reflecting the light like an animal's in the dark. My breath came in short gasps. I took a step back and they moved, shifting closer. I grabbed my backpack, knife still in hand, and ran. I didn't care where, just away. Branches tore at my clothes, my skin, but I didn't stop. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps matching mine, chasing me through the dark. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the dirt path. Silence. No footsteps, no figures, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't stop. I kept moving until I reached my car, throwing my gear inside and speeding off without looking back. I don't know who they were or what they wanted. I don't want to know, but I'll never go camping alone again. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. It wasn't anything crazy, just a weekend out in the woods, a few miles off trail in a national forest, somewhere quiet and isolated. That was the point. No people, no noise, just me, my tent, and the sound of nature. It was supposed to be peaceful. I arrived at the trailhead on a Friday afternoon. My pack was heavy, but I had everything I needed: tent, food, water, my knife, a small hatchet, and a first aid kit. The hike in was rougher than I expected. The sun was still up, but the tree cover was thick, making it feel later than it was. By the time I found a good spot to set up camp, I was exhausted. The clearing I picked wasn't too large, just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. It was surrounded by thick trees, and beyond them, the land sloped downward into deeper forest. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. Dinner was a simple meal, a can of chili heated over the fire. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and the noises of the forest came alive. The sound of crickets, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, an owl somewhere in the distance. It was exactly what I had wanted. But then, something changed. It started with a sound. Not an animal sound, not the wind. It was distant at first, but distinct. A crunch, like something stepping on leaves. I tried to ignore it at first. Could have been a deer, could have been anything. But then I heard it again, closer. My fire crackled, and in its light, the shadows around me danced. I kept looking around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I was alone in the woods, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the unease didn't leave. It settled deep in my gut, and no matter how much I told myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake it. I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself inside. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made me tense up. The wind moved the branches, making them creak, and every so often, I'd hear another crunch of leaves. It was probably an animal. That's what I told myself. Probably just a raccoon or a possum sniffing around my campsite. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned out, and the darkness inside the tent felt suffocating. My breath was loud, too loud. Then I heard it, breathing, outside my tent. Not an animal, not the wind. Something big, slow, controlled. It was so close I could hear the slight whistle of air through a nose. I stopped breathing, my body frozen. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. I wanted to reach for my knife, but I was afraid to move. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then a soft step, another. It circled my tent. I could hear it shifting through the leaves, slow and deliberate, testing, waiting. and then silence. I stayed like that, frozen, listening for any movement. I don't know how long it was before I finally allowed myself to breathe. Eventually, exhaustion won. My body shut down and I fell into a restless sleep. Morning came, and the fear from the night before felt distant, almost like a bad dream. But when I crawled out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints, human footprints, circling my tent, stopping just at the entrance. My stomach dropped. I scanned the trees, my heart hammering. Someone had been out here, walking around my campsite in the middle of the night, watching me. The thought made my skin crawl. I had two options: pack up and leave, or stay one more night and keep my guard up. I had come all this way for a weekend alone, and I told myself that it was probably just some random hiker who had gotten lost and stumbled across my camp. That was the logical explanation, right? I tried to shake it off. I spent the day hiking, exploring the forest, trying to clear my head, but that uneasy feeling never left. The woods, which had felt peaceful the day before, now felt suffocating. Every rustle in the trees made me tense up. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, I forced myself to start another fire. I ate, sat by the flames, and kept my knife close. I wasn't going to sleep easily that night, not after what I had seen that morning. And then, as the fire crackled and the sky darkened, I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't make out a face, couldn't tell if they were looking at me, but they were there, standing still, watching. My blood turned to ice. My brain screamed at me to move, to do something, but I just sat there, staring back. Then, just as slowly as they had appeared, they stepped back into the darkness. I didn't wait. I grabbed my knife, threw my pack together, and left the campsite. I didn't care that it was night, that I'd have to navigate the trail in the dark. I needed to get out of those woods. The hike back to my car was the longest, most terrifying trek of my life. Every sound, every shadow made my pulse spike. I kept expecting to see someone behind me, just out of reach of my flashlight, but I never did. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I do know one thing: I'll never go camping alone again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A full week in the deep woods, far from people, noise, and the endless stress of daily life. Just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched forest. I'd done trips like this before, but never for this long. The idea of really testing myself, living off the land as much as possible, felt like the challenge I needed. I planned it carefully. Enough food for 5 days, supplemented by fishing and whatever else I could forage. A sturdy tent, good boots, a knife, my sleeping bag, and a reliable map. No phone, no GPS, just the old school way of getting lost in the wild. The first day was perfect. The sun cut through the trees in golden beams as I hiked deeper into the forest. The weight of my pack was a good kind of weight, the kind that made me feel prepared. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot, a flat clearing near a slow-moving stream, tucked between thick trees. I set up camp, built a fire, and cooked one of my packed meals. Felt good, peaceful. I hadn't felt this relaxed in years. The second day, I explored the area. I followed the stream for miles, marking my path carefully so I wouldn't get lost. The forest was dense, but not unfriendly. The sound of birds, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. It felt alive, but not threatening. I fished in the afternoon, caught 2 small trout, and cooked them over my fire as the sky turned dark. It was on the third day that something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling, a slight change in the air. The silence seemed heavier. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the wind, seemed muted. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. I had gotten a little farther from camp than I meant to, and as I turned back, I noticed something strange. A tree stripped of its bark. not in the way animals do it. This was clean, precise, as if someone had taken a knife and peeled it away in long, careful strips. I ran my fingers over the wood. It was smooth, unnatural. I looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just my own breathing. I picked up my pace, making my way back to camp as quickly as I could without outright running. By the time I got there, the sun was dipping below the trees, and the feeling of unease hadn't left me. I forced myself to eat, to tend the fire, to act normal. But that night, I barely slept. Every little noise made my skin prickle. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Things I normally ignored suddenly felt deliberate, like something was out there watching. The next morning, I told myself I was being paranoid. I had been alone too long, my mind playing tricks on me. I packed up a small bag and set out to explore again, keeping my knife close. But as I walked, I found more of those trees, more bark stripped away in those same clean, precise lines. And something worse, footprints, not animal tracks, human, barefoot, deep pressing into the damp earth. And they weren't old. I crouched down, my stomach twisting. They led deeper into the woods, away from my camp. I turned around, moving quickly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. When I got back, my camp was different. My tent was open, not torn, not rummaged through, just open. My sleeping bag was unzipped, slightly pulled out. My food, my gear, all untouched. But someone had been there. I stood there for a long time, my heart hammering. I wanted to believe I had left it like that I had just forgotten to zip the tent. But I knew better. Someone had been here. Someone was watching me. I made a decision. I packed up everything. I had planned to stay longer, but nothing about this felt right. I needed to leave. As I hiked back, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I had that feeling again, that thick, suffocating silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I moved fast, pushing myself, ignoring the burning in my legs. But as I walked, I noticed something else. The footprints. They weren't behind me anymore. They were alongside mine. They had been following me the whole time. I don't remember the last few miles. I just remember running, my pack slamming against my back, branches whipping my face. I didn't stop until I burst out onto the old dirt road where my truck was parked. I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to breathe. I never saw them. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I wasn't alone. And I know they never meant for me to leave. I had planned this camping trip for months. Work had been draining, and I needed to get away from everything. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The forest I chose was deep in the mountains, far from civilization. It was perfect. No cell service, no noise, just the sounds of nature. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my truck at the end of a narrow dirt road, and hiked about 5 miles into the woods. I had a topographic map, a compass, and all the gear I needed. The spot I picked was near a small creek, with a clearing large enough for my tent. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered firewood. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I built a fire and cooked some canned food over the flames. The warmth was comforting, and I let myself relax, listening to the crackling wood and the occasional chirp of insects. By the time I crawled into my tent, the temperature had dropped. I zipped up my sleeping bag and listened to the forest. It was peaceful, that kind of quiet that settles in when you're truly alone. I drifted off, feeling safe in my little pocket of wilderness. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had died down, leaving behind a dull orange glow in the embers. Something had woken me up, but I wasn't sure what. I lay there listening. The forest was different now. No crickets, no wind, just silence. Then a sound. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Not an animal, too heavy. It was coming from the trees behind my tent. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just my imagination. Maybe a deer. maybe a branch falling. I turned onto my side and tried to sleep. Then, another sound. Closer. This time, it was a rustling noise, like fabric brushing against branches. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was just glowing embers now. My surroundings were pitch black. I shined the light around. Nothing, just trees. I forced myself to relax, convincing myself it was just the forest playing tricks on me. But I kept my knife close, just in case. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. I made coffee over the fire and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. I told myself I was being paranoid. After breakfast, I decided to hike deeper into the woods. The scenery was breathtaking. Dense trees, a small stream, and no signs of other people. I walked for hours, occasionally marking trees so I wouldn't get lost. Then, I found something strange. A clearing with a makeshift shelter. It looked abandoned. Just a tarp tied between trees, an old fire pit, and some scattered trash. I walked closer. There were clothes on the ground, dirty and torn. A backpack sat nearby, covered in leaves. I hesitated before checking it. Inside were a few personal items, a wallet, a phone, and some snacks. The phone was dead. The wallet had an ID, but the name meant nothing to me. Something about it made me uneasy. Whoever had been here hadn't packed up and left. It looked like they left in a hurry. I decided to head back to my camp. I had a growing feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, I built my fire bigger, hoping it would keep any unwanted visitors away. I sat up for a long time, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it was different. It wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, slow and deep, somewhere close. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. Nothing. Then I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the fire's glow, standing still, watching. My heart pounded. I reached for my knife. I yelled out, "Who's there?" No response. The figure didn't move. Then, in an instant, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going until the sun rose. The moment it was light enough, I packed my gear and left. I hiked back to my truck faster than I thought possible, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the tree line, watching me leave. I never went back. I love camping. I always have. The silence, the isolation, the way the trees seem to close in around you when the fire dims. It's something I used to crave. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever go into the woods alone again. I had planned a solo trip to a remote area in Montana. I wanted solitude, no other campers, no distractions. Just me, my tent, and the endless stretch of wilderness. I had done solo trips before, but this one was different. The location was further from civilization than I'd ever gone. No cell service, no nearby trails, just miles of thick forest and deep valleys. It was perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my truck at the end of a dirt road, and hiked about 2 miles to my chosen campsite. The area was beautiful, dense trees all around, a clear view of the sky above. The air smelled fresh, earthy, untouched. I set up my tent near a small clearing, started a fire, and made dinner. The first night was uneventful. Just the usual sounds of the forest, wind rustling the trees, the occasional owl, the distant crack of a branch breaking under the weight of something unseen. I slept well. The second day, I explored the area. I hiked deeper into the woods, following a small creek. I noticed that the deeper I went, the quieter it got. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but after a while, I realized the usual forest sounds. The birds, the insects were absent. I stopped walking, listening closely. Nothing, just silence. It was unsettling, but I shook it off and continued. The woods can be unpredictable. That night, things started to feel off. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard something in the distance. It wasn't an animal. It was too rhythmic, too controlled. It sounded like footsteps. I turned off my lantern and sat in the dark, listening. The sound continued for a while, then stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. Maybe a deer. I went into my tent and forced myself to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up. Something wasn't right. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. I listened closely. The usual nighttime sounds were gone again. Just silence. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Then, in the distance, I heard it crunching, slow and deliberate. Someone or something was walking just beyond my campsite. I lay still, my heart hammering. The footsteps moved closer. I reached for my flashlight, but stopped myself. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. Minutes passed, then an hour. The footsteps stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the knife I kept in my pack. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I checked the perimeter of my campsite. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and I expected to see animal tracks. But instead, I saw something else. Footprints. Bare human footprints. They led from the edge of the clearing, circled my tent, then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach twisted. I wasn't alone. I packed my things as quickly as I could. I had planned to stay for another 2 nights, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I needed to get out of there. As I was packing up my tent, I heard something in the trees. A faint rustling, like someone shifting their weight. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my gear and started back toward my truck. The hike back felt longer than before. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf sent my heart into overdrive. But I saw nothing. No movement, no figures in the trees. Just the same eerie silence that had settled over the woods the day before. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back and got in. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, then died. My breath caught in my throat. I tried again. Nothing. My battery was dead. I swore under my breath, trying to think. My truck was old, but it had never done this before. I reached for my phone, no service, of course. I was miles from the nearest town with no way to call for help. I would have to walk back. As I stepped out of the truck, I felt it again. That sensation of being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the dense, unmoving forest. I grabbed my pack and started walking down the dirt road. It would be a long walk, but I had no choice. I walked for about an hour before I heard something behind me. A rustling in the bushes, too close to be the wind, quickened my pace. The rustling kept up. I broke into a jog, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The sound followed. Then, ahead of me, something moved. A figure stepped onto the road. I froze. It was a man, barefoot, dirty, wearing tattered clothes. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He stood there, watching me, unblinking. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then he took a step forward. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally reached a small roadside gas station, I collapsed against the door, gasping for air. The clerk inside stared at me, wide-eyed. I must have looked insane. I told them everything. The silent woods, the footprints, the man on the road. They called the police. When the officers arrived, they drove me back to my truck. It was still there, untouched. But the strangest part? When they checked the battery, it was fine. The truck started on the first try. The police searched the area but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone living out there. Just an empty stretch of woods. They said I was probably just spooked, that maybe it was a homeless man passing through. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again. I had been planning the camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a way to clear my head, get away from the constant buzz of city life, and just breathe for a while. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any designated camping grounds. I wanted solitude, real solitude, the kind where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant calls of animals. The drive took longer than I expected, winding roads leading me further away from civilization. My phone lost signal miles before I reached my planned campsite, but I didn't mind. That was part of the appeal. I parked my truck at the edge of a dirt path and hiked the rest of the way in, carrying only the essentials: a tent, some food, a knife, and a rifle just in case. I wasn't worried about anything out here. At worst, I figured I might have to deal with some wildlife, but I had done enough hunting to know how to handle myself. By the time I set up camp, the sun was dipping below the trees. I built a small fire and sat by it, eating a simple meal of beef jerky and trail mix. The forest was alive with movement, the way it always is at night. Twigs snapped in the distance. The occasional rustle in the bushes caught my ear, but I knew better than to let my mind wander into paranoia. Animals were everywhere, and most of them had no interest in me. As the night deepened, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the trees. I closed my eyes and let the quiet take over. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The fire outside was just a dim glow. Everything was still, too still. The usual forest sounds had faded into silence. Then I heard it, a crunch, slow, deliberate, not the scurry of a small animal, not the sudden burst of movement from a deer. It was the sound of a footstep, heavy and careful. It came from the trees, just beyond the fire's dying light. I held my breath, my heart thudding in my ears. I listened for a long time, straining to hear anything more, but there was nothing. No retreating steps, no rustling of leaves, just silence. After a while, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, maybe just a branch falling, and I forced myself to sleep. Morning came with no signs of anything unusual. I told myself I had been paranoid and shook off the unease lingering in my chest. I spent the day hiking, following the trails I had marked on my map. The forest was beautiful, untouched. I didn't see another person all day. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was setting again. I built another fire, cooked a small meal, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But that feeling, the one I had last night, never fully left me. It sat at the back of my mind like a shadow, always there but just out of sight. That night, I woke up again. The fire was nearly out, but I could still make out the vague shapes of trees in the darkness. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer. I sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. My rifle was within arm's reach, and I grabbed it, my fingers tightening around the stock. I listened, my heart pounding. The footsteps were circling my camp, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I thought about calling out, but something told me not to. Instead, I waited. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I stayed awake for hours, gripping my rifle, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When I finally stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints circling my camp. I wasn't alone. Someone had been out there watching me. I packed up my gear in record time. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe a hiker had wandered too close, but I knew that wasn't true. What kind of hiker walks in circles around someone's tent in the middle of the night and then disappears without a trace? The hike back to my truck felt longer than it should have. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened, but I never heard anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I moved faster, pushing through branches, practically jogging by the time I reached my truck. When I finally saw it, parked right where I left it, I felt a wave of relief until I noticed something. A single, muddy handprint on the driver's side window. I didn't hesitate. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in a town, surrounded by people. I still don't know who was out there that night. I never went back to find out. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I still get that feeling, that weight in my chest, like someone's watching. And I wonder if whoever it was still remembers me, too. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. After months of stress from work, all I wanted was a weekend away from the noise of the city. I packed my gear carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food and water, a first aid kit, and my trusted knife. The plan was simple: drive out to a remote spot deep in the national forest, hike a few miles in, and set up camp by a quiet stream. The drive out was uneventful, long stretches of highway giving way to winding dirt roads cutting through thick forest. I finally reached the entrance to the trail around noon. The sun was high, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, a slight breeze, and just warm enough to be comfortable. I locked my truck, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started my hike. The path was well-trodden at first, but the deeper I went, the narrower it became. Soon, I was following a barely visible trail through dense trees. Felt peaceful. Just the sound of birds, the rustling leaves, and my boots crunching against the earth. A couple of hours in, I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a slow-moving stream. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Quiet, secluded, and untouched. I set up my tent, collected some firewood, and took a few moments to just breathe it all in. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sun cast long shadows through the trees. After getting camp set up, I sat on a fallen log, ate some jerky, and watched the stream flow by. The quiet was almost too perfect. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I built a fire and prepared my dinner. Just a simple can of chili heated over the flames. The sound of the fire crackling was comforting, the only break in the silence around me. But as the darkness deepened, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The air was still, but the usual night sounds, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, had faded away. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe I wasn't used to this level of silence after years of city living. I shook it off, ate my dinner, and eventually climbed into my tent. The fabric rustled as I zipped myself inside, cocooned in my sleeping bag. My knife lay within reach, just in case. I must have dozed off because I woke up to a sound just outside my tent. It was faint but distinct. A soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. My body tensed. I held my breath, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow through the fabric of my tent. Another step, closer this time. I reached for my knife slowly, careful not to make a sound. I strained my ears, waiting. Then nothing. The silence stretched. Maybe it had been an animal, a deer or a raccoon looking for food. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After what felt like hours, I finally let out a slow breath and forced myself to relax. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and immediately noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were footprints, not animal tracks, human. They circled my tent, stopping just a few feet from where I had been sleeping. I stared at them, heart hammering. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. Someone had been out here, watching me, standing outside my tent in the middle of the night. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but a part of me didn't want to panic. Maybe it was just another camper who had wandered too close. Maybe it was a ranger checking the area. I forced myself to stay calm. Still, I kept my knife close as I went about my morning routine. I made coffee, ate a protein bar, and tried to shake the eerie feeling gnawing at my gut. But as I looked around, I realized something else was wrong. My firewood pile had been moved. The logs were stacked differently than I had left them. And then I saw it, a single boot print, larger than my own, leading away from my camp, back into the trees. Whoever had been here hadn't just stumbled by. They had stayed, watched, then walked away into the woods. I decided right then I was leaving. I packed quickly, double-checking my gear. Everything was still there, untouched, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't let up. The hike back to my truck was tense. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf set me on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But I didn't. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors the moment I got in. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, leaving the forest behind. I never went back to that place again. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lucky, that whoever had been out there in the woods with me had let me leave. But the worst part? I'll never know who it was, or what they wanted, and that's what keeps me up at night. I remember the cold more than anything else. The way it clung to my skin, how it seeped through my clothes no matter how many layers I had on. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the kind of cold that made you feel like you were being watched. A heavy, oppressive stillness that settled over everything. The air barely moved, the trees didn't sway, and even my own breath felt too loud in the silence. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping for some peace and quiet. The idea of getting away from the city, from the constant buzz of traffic and people, had seemed like a good idea. I had pictured myself sitting by a fireplace, drinking coffee, reading a book, maybe even doing some writing. Just me and the wilderness. But the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The cabin was small, tucked deep into the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The road leading up to it was barely a road at all, just a narrow path of packed dirt winding through the trees. My car's tires had struggled against the uneven ground, slipping in the patches of ice that hadn't melted from the last snowfall. By the time I reached the cabin, my nerves were already on edge. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint hum of the wind. The trees stood tall and motionless, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the overcast sky. The cabin itself was simple. One room with a small bathroom, a kitchenette, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. Dust clung to the wooden furniture, and the air smelled stale, like old wood and dampness. There were no signs that anyone had been here recently. The owner had said he'd left the key under the doormat, but when I lifted it, there was nothing there. The door, however, was unlocked. That should have been my first warning. I pushed the thought aside, assuming the owner had forgotten to lock it the last time he was here. The inside was cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the thermostat, but it didn't seem to work. I had brought firewood, but I didn't want to use it all on the first night. Instead, I settled for bundling up in my thickest clothes, lighting a few candles for warmth, and trying to relax. But I couldn't. There was a feeling in the cabin, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't a noise or a shadow, just a presence, a weight pressing down on me. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see something standing in the tree line. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jolt awake. The wind against the windows, the creaking of the wooden walls as the cabin settled, the distant snap of a branch outside. I told myself it was just the woods, just nature doing what it always did. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The second day, I tried to distract myself. I went for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The forest was vast, stretching endlessly in all directions. I made sure to mark my way, scratching an X into the bark of trees every few feet. The last thing I needed was to get lost out here. About an hour in, I found something strange. Clearing, not a natural one. The trees had been cut down, the stumps left behind like broken teeth. In the center was something even stranger, a small pile of bones. They were clean, picked dry, arranged in a careful stack. Not scattered, not left behind by some animal, but placed there. Deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I had just walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. My first instinct was to turn back, to get away from that place as fast as possible. But as I turned, I noticed something else. Something that made my breath catch in my throat. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh ones. Leading away from the pile of bones and disappearing into the trees. Someone had been here, recently, I hurried back to the cabin, my heart pounding. I locked the door behind me, pushing a chair up against it for good measure. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe a hunter? But why leave a pile of bones in the middle of nowhere? And why did I feel like I was being watched? That night was worse than the first. I kept the fireplace going, trying to push away the cold, but it didn't help. Sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the flickering firelight, listening, waiting. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on the door. I froze. My mind went blank. No one should have been out here. No one. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I stayed silent, barely breathing. My fingers tightened around the blanket, my body stiff with fear. Whoever was outside didn't try to open the door. They just stood there, waiting. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. But it never did. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The silence stretched on. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I made my decision. I had to leave. The problem was my car. It was parked about 100 yards from the cabin, near the edge of the tree line. If someone was out there, they would see me the second I stepped outside. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag with shaking hands. I peered out the window, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The woods were still and quiet. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall, but I ignored it. I kept my eyes on my car, moving quickly, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the trees, circling my cabin, and stopping right outside my door. I ran. I didn't care how much noise I made, didn't care if whoever had been out here was still watching. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again, and again. On the third try, the engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the narrow dirt road, barely keeping control as the car slid on patches of ice. I didn't stop, not until I saw the first signs of civilization. I never went back. I never even told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? It wasn't a ghost or some monster from a story. It was a person. Someone had been watching me, following me, and I don't know what they wanted. I don't want to know. I needed to get away. That was the only thing on my mind when I packed my truck and started driving. The stress had been getting to me, work, the noise of the city, the same people, the same streets, the same routine. I just wanted silence, space, and time to myself. So, I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far away from anyone or anything that could remind me of my life back home. The drive was long, and the roads became narrower as I got closer. Eventually, the pavement ended, leaving me on a dirt path surrounded by towering trees. The GPS signal was gone, but I had downloaded the map beforehand. According to it, I had about 5 more miles to go. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the treetops, and the further I drove, the less it felt like the modern world existed. There were no signs of people, no houses, no power lines, not even another car. It was exactly what I wanted. The cabin appeared just as the last bit of daylight faded. It was old but sturdy, with a slanted roof and a small porch. The wood was worn, but it had character. The moment I stepped out of the truck, the silence wrapped around me. No distant sounds of traffic, no humming of appliances, just the wind and the occasional rustling in the trees. Inside, the air was stale, but that was expected. It smelled like wood and dust, and the furniture looked like it had been there for decades. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim yellow light over the room. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with an old bed that creaked when I sat on it. I set up my things, unpacked a few clothes, put some food in the fridge, and checked my phone. No signal. That was fine. That was the point. The first night was peaceful. I read a book by the fireplace, listened to the sounds of the woods, and let myself relax for the first time in months. Felt good. But then, things started to change. It was little things at first. On the second morning, I found the front door slightly open. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed, but maybe I was mistaken. I shrugged it off. That night, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew what animals sounded like. This was different. It was deliberate. Slow, careful steps just beyond the porch. I held my breath and waited, but when I finally got the courage to check, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I told myself it was probably a hiker, maybe someone passing through, but that didn't make sense. I was too far from any trails, and there were no other cabins nearby. I started feeling uneasy. I kept the door locked at all times. I kept my knife close. The next few nights, the sounds continued. Footsteps circling the cabin, a soft scratching on the walls, and then on the fourth night, something worse. I woke up to a sound inside the cabin. It was faint, but it was there. A shift in the air, a creak in the floorboards. I stayed still, barely breathing. I wasn't alone. I reached for my knife and slowly sat up, straining my ears. The sound was coming from the main room. Something moving. Someone moving. I forced myself to stand, to move as silently as possible. The door to my room was slightly open, just enough for me to see. The front door was wide open. My heart pounded. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I didn't wait. I grabbed my truck keys, ran outside, and locked myself in my truck. I turned the engine on, headlights flooding the area. There was no one. Nothing. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching, waiting, but the woods were still. Eventually, I forced myself to go back inside. I checked every corner, every closet, every possible hiding spot. Nothing, but something had been there. I barely slept that night. The next day, I packed my things. I didn't care how much time I had left on the rental. I was done. I drove fast, not looking back, not stopping until I reached the highway. The moment my phone had service, I called the cabin owner. They were quiet for a moment before finally speaking. "You're not the first to leave early." I didn't want to be there. The drive up to the cabin had been long, too long, and the road turned into a mess of dirt and gravel for the last 30 miles. The rental car struggled on the uneven ground, the tires spitting up dust and loose stones, and every bump in the road made the suspension groan. The sun had started its slow descent behind the thick tree line, casting long shadows across the ground, stretching out like reaching fingers. I gripped the wheel tighter. I hadn't picked this place. It was forced on me by my brother, who thought I needed some time alone. "Disconnect, clear your head," he'd said. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. The cabin wasn't much, just a small wooden structure tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The trees surrounding it were thick and endless, swallowing up any sign of civilization. The nearest town was an hour away, a small, dying place with a gas station, a diner, and not much else. Perfect for solitude. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it, the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, pressing in from all sides. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of life, just stillness. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place smelled like old wood and dust, a stale scent that settled into the walls. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a thin, itchy blanket. Functional but not welcoming. I went through the usual motions, unpacked my bag, checked my phone, no signal, and lit a fire in the wood stove as the night crept in. The air outside had turned cold fast. I sat in the chair by the fire, listening to the wood crackle, and for the first time in a long time, I let my thoughts wander. That was a mistake. I don't know how long I sat there, but at some point, something changed. The silence outside was no longer empty. It felt like it was watching. I tried to shake it off, but my gut twisted in a way I couldn't ignore. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out into the darkness. Nothing, just trees, their trunks barely visible under the dim moonlight. But the feeling stayed, that pressure, that weight of something unseen pressing against me. I locked the door, checked the windows, and told myself I was being paranoid. I sat back down, but the fire didn't feel warm anymore. The first sound came hours later, a dull, distant thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. My breath caught. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stayed still, ears straining, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Then, just as I convinced myself I imagined it, another thud. Closer. I stood, heart hammering in my chest. I moved to the window again, slowly, carefully, and peered outside. The trees stood still. The ground was undisturbed, but something was there. I could feel it. The thudding continued, irregular, moving closer with each impact. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I turned off the fire, plunging the cabin into darkness. I wanted to see outside without being seen myself. I moved to the window again, staring out. The sound had stopped. The forest was quiet. Then movement. A shape, barely visible, standing just at the tree line. Too far to make out details, but close enough to know it wasn't an animal. It was tall, motionless, watching. I didn't move. My body was locked in place, my pulse pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and still it didn't move. Then, as if it knew I was watching, it stepped back into the trees, vanishing into the blackness. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Every gust of wind against the walls sent a spike of panic through me. Morning took forever to come, but when it did, I went outside, searching for any sign that what I saw was real. The ground near the tree line was disturbed. Large impressions like footprints, but wrong. Too deep, too wide. I should have left right then. Should have packed my bag, gotten in the car, and never looked back. But I didn't. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was sleep-deprived, paranoid. The next night, it came back. This time, I heard it breathing. I don't know how to describe it, but it was deep, wrong. A sound that rumbled through the trees and seeped into my bones. I locked the door, sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and held my breath. It was closer now, right outside. A long, slow drag of breath, and then the handle of the door moved. I gripped the knife I had taken from the kitchen, but I knew it wouldn't matter. If it wanted in, it would get in. The handle stopped moving. The breathing grew fainter, retreating. I stayed on the floor until the first light of morning crept through the windows. Then I left. I didn't pack. I didn't turn off the fire. I didn't care. I got into the car and drove, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, where my phone finally had service. I called my brother. I don't remember what I said, only that my voice shook the entire time. I never went back, never tried to find out what it was. Whatever stood outside that cabin that night, whatever breathed against that door, it wasn't human. And I don't ever want to know what it was. I should have never gone up there alone. I wanted to clear my head. That was the whole reason I rented the cabin. Just a small place in the woods, quiet, far from the city noise. I found it on some rental site, a little old cabin tucked away in the forest, deep enough that there were no neighbors, but not so far that I couldn't drive back into town if I needed something. It seemed perfect at the time. The first night was peaceful, the kind of silence I hadn't experienced in years. No cars honking, no people talking, no distractions. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the occasional rustling of an animal moving through the brush. I remember sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, thinking I'd made the right decision coming here. The second night, I started noticing things. Small things. The door was slightly open when I woke up, even though I was sure I had locked it. I chalked it up to the wind. Then I found my flashlight lying in the dirt outside, even though I hadn't used it. Maybe I dropped it, I told myself. Maybe I forgot. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went to bed early, exhausted from hiking all day. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a normal wake-up. My body was on high alert. You know that feeling when something is just wrong? When your instincts scream at you even if you don't know why. That's what it was. I lay there listening. The forest was dead silent. Not even the wind. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound, like someone shifting their weight on the porch. slow, careful. I stayed completely still, listening. My heart was hammering in my chest. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but when I pressed the power button, the screen didn't turn on. Dead battery. I could have sworn I charged it before bed. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. A single, deliberate step, then nothing. I lay there for what felt like hours, but I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows. Everything seemed normal. Door locked, windows shut, no footprints on the porch. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. But then I noticed my keys were gone. I checked my bag, my jacket, even under the bed. I was sure I had left them on the kitchen counter, but they weren't there. I started feeling uneasy. Things weren't adding up. Still, I convinced myself I had just misplaced them. I spent most of the day searching the cabin and the area around it. Finally, I found them half buried in the dirt behind the cabin. That night, I barricaded the door, dragged the small table in front of it, wedged a chair under the handle, just in case. I didn't sleep much. Every small noise made my skin crawl. I kept my flashlight next to me, checking the time every hour. Nothing happened. Then the power went out. I sat up, gripping the flashlight. The room was completely black, the kind of darkness that messes with your head. I tried the light switch, nothing. My breathing was loud in the silence. I listened, straining my ears, trying to hear anything over my own heartbeat. And then footsteps, slow, careful, right outside the cabin. I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door. The footsteps stopped. The doorknob rattled, gently at first, then more forcefully. The barricade held. I gripped the flashlight, waiting, praying. The rattling stopped. Then, nothing. I don't know how long I sat there. Eventually, the power flickered back on. Everything was quiet. I stayed awake until morning. The next day, I packed my stuff. I didn't care if I had paid for a week. I was leaving. But when I got to my car, the driver's side door was open. Not just unlocked, wide open. My stomach dropped. I had locked it. I was sure I had. I checked inside. My bag had been dumped out. Clothes, toiletries, everything scattered. My phone was lying on the seat. The screen shattered. The keys were still in my pocket, but the car wouldn't start. The engine wouldn't even turn over. I tried again and again, but nothing. It was as if the battery had been drained overnight. That was when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the trees to my car. Bare feet, deep in the mud, but no prints leading away. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, anything I could carry, and I ran. I didn't care where, just away from that cabin. I followed the road, hoping a car would pass. After an hour, my legs were burning, my throat dry. But then, finally, headlights. I waved frantically. The car stopped. An older man rolled down the window. I must have looked half crazy, but I didn't care. I told him everything. He just listened, his expression unreadable. Then, he nodded slowly and said, "You were lucky." He drove me back to town, never asking another question. I called a tow truck the next morning, had them pick up my car. The mechanic said the battery was completely drained, like something had been pulling power from it all night. I don't know who was out there, or what they wanted. I just know I'm never going back. I never should have gone back to that cabin. It was meant to be a quiet retreat, a week away from everything. Work, people, the endless noise of life. I had rented the place through some backwoods rental site, the kind that doesn't bother with glossy photos or polished descriptions. Just an address, a price, and a key waiting under the mat. It was deep in the woods, miles from any main road. That's what I wanted. Silence, solitude. I got there in the late afternoon. The road had turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, winding deeper into the trees. The cabin itself was old, simple, built from thick logs with a sagging porch and a rusted-out truck parked to the side. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd expect to find in some missing persons case. Inside, it was basic. A small kitchen with an old fridge that hummed too loudly, A single bedroom with a bed that looked clean but felt stiff, and a living room with a fireplace, an old couch, and a coffee table covered in knife marks. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio with a broken antenna. That first night was quiet, too quiet, the kind that makes you aware of every creak, every whisper of wind through the trees. I kept telling myself that's what I wanted, but there was something off. I noticed it when I went outside to get firewood. Path. It ran along the edge of the trees, barely noticeable in the fading light. Not an animal trail. It was too straight, too well worn. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that path. The second day, I followed it. It stretched deeper into the forest, curving around thick trunks, vanishing into the undergrowth. I walked for what felt like an hour before I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. Footprints. Fresh. Too big to be mine, too defined to be old. Someone had walked this path recently. I stopped and listened. Nothing but the rustling of leaves. But that feeling, the one you get when someone is watching you, settled deep in my gut. I turned back. That night, I locked the door. I wedged a chair under the handle. I listened. The wind had picked up, branches scraping against the roof, but something else was out there. I swear I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. Morning came and I checked outside. The chair was still against the door, but in the dirt just beyond the porch steps were footprints. Big, deep, circling the cabin. Someone had been there. I packed my things. I was ready to leave, but the car wouldn't start. I popped the hood, checked the battery, it was fine. No reason for it not to work. That's when I saw it. A nail, long and rusted, jammed into my back tire. Not an accident. Someone had done it on purpose. I went back inside. I didn't know what else to do. I had no cell service, no neighbors, nothing but miles of empty forest in every direction. I tried to calm myself, but every sound made my pulse jump. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on the couch, facing the door, a fire poker in my hand. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the cabin. Slow, careful, like whoever was out there knew I was listening. I stayed like that until morning. When the sun finally rose, I went outside. More footprints, and something else. A rope, coiled neatly on the porch, right next to the door. I left everything behind, grabbed my keys, my bag, and ran. I didn't care about the tire. I drove on the rim until I hit pavement, until I saw another car, until I reached a gas station where I could breathe again. I called the rental company. They acted like I was crazy, said no one had rented that cabin in months. But someone had been there. Someone had been watching. I never should have gone back to that cabin. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A full weekend alone in a cabin deep in the woods. No distractions, no noise, just peace. The cabin belonged to an old friend of mine who hardly ever used it, and he was happy to let me stay as long as I wanted. I packed enough supplies to last 4 days: food, water, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and my hunting rifle just in case. The drive took longer than expected. The last hour was spent on a narrow dirt road, winding through thick forest. No cell service. The trees crowded the road, making it feel like I was being swallowed whole by the wilderness. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The place was simple but solid: one story, a steep roof, a small porch out front. The inside was rustic: wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with an old gas stove. A single bedroom with a creaky bed and a heavy wooden dresser. No electricity, just oil lamps and a generator I had no intention of using. I liked the quiet. I unloaded my gear, locked my truck, and settled in. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was exactly what I wanted. I ate a quick meal, lit a lantern, and read for a while before turning in early. That first night, something woke me up. I wasn't sure what at first. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was cold. Then I heard it again, a dull thud from outside. It sounded like something heavy hitting the ground. A fallen branch? An animal? I listened for a while, but the sound didn't come again. I eventually drifted back to sleep. Morning came, and I stepped outside to get some fresh air. That's when I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Large, booted footprints leading from the tree line to the porch. I froze. I had locked the door before bed. If someone had tried to get in, they hadn't forced it. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The prints led away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. It made no sense. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? This place was miles from the nearest road. I spent the day exploring the area, trying to shake off the unease. The woods were dense, quiet, untouched. I brought my rifle with me just in case. Every so often, I thought I heard something, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but it was probably just small animals. As the sun started to set, I returned to the cabin. I felt better than I had in the morning. The footprints had been strange, but there was no sign of anyone around. Maybe they had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. That night, I made sure to lock up tight. I kept my rifle close just in case. I barely slept. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. A dull thud outside. Then another, and another. Footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Silence stretched out for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, the doorknob turned. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. The lock held, but I heard the soft creak of wood as someone shifted their weight outside the door. Then nothing. I didn't sleep after that. I waited, gripping my rifle, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind against the cabin walls. Eventually, morning came. When I stepped outside, the footprints were there again. This time, they weren't just leading up to the porch. They circled the cabin. I was no longer alone. I packed my things immediately. I had planned to stay for 4 days, but there was no way I was spending another night here. I threw everything into my truck, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I was an hour away, back on paved roads with my phone buzzing in my lap, finally getting a signal again. Later, my friend called to ask how the trip was. I told him everything. There was a long silence before he spoke. That cabin doesn't have a back door. I never went back. I needed to get away. Life had been weighing down on me, and when my uncle offered his old hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere for a weekend, I took the chance. I packed enough food and water for a few days, threw my rifle in the truck just in case, and drove out. The road was rough, mostly dirt and gravel, winding through miles of dense forest. The farther I went, the less I saw of civilization. No houses, no power lines, no signs of people. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. It was a small, one-room structure made of dark, weathered wood. The windows were old and slightly warped, the glass smudged with dirt. A single porch light flickered weakly as I stepped up to the door. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of dust and aged wood. The furniture was sparse. A bed against the wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a rusty wood-burning stove. A set of deer antlers hung above the doorway, the only decoration in the place. I locked the door behind me and set my bags down. The first thing I did was check my phone. No service, as expected. That was fine. I was here to be alone. No distractions, no noise, just me and the quiet of the woods. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire in the stove, cooked some canned soup, and sat at the table, listening to the wind outside. Occasionally, I heard the distant howl of a coyote or the snap of a branch in the woods, but nothing unusual. I read a book until my eyes grew heavy, then stretched out on the bed, my rifle within reach, just in case. I woke up sometime after midnight, feeling off. Not scared, exactly, but alert, like something had pulled me from my sleep. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. The wind had stopped. The forest outside was completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just nothing. I sat up slowly, listening. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves outside, something moving close to the cabin. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window, pressing my face to the glass. The porch light barely illuminated the front yard, but I could make out the trees, the dirt path leading back to my truck. Nothing else. Another crunch. Closer this time. I held my breath. The sound was coming from the right side of the cabin, near the back. I moved carefully to the back window, my heart pounding. The glass was dirty, but I could see movement, something shifting between the trees. A dark shape, low to the ground, moving slowly. A bear? Maybe, but something felt wrong. The shape didn't move like a bear. It was too smooth, too deliberate. Then, as I watched, it stopped, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then I saw it. Ahead, just barely visible in the dim light, peeking out from behind a tree. Watching me, I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the rifle. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Could have been an animal. Could have been a person. Either way, I wasn't about to find out. I backed away from the window and locked the door, checking the latch twice. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it through the front window, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. When I turned it toward the back window, I froze. The head was gone, but the shape was closer now. I kept the light on it for a full minute, waiting for it to move. Didn't. It just stood there, half hidden behind the trees. I closed the blinds, my hands shaking. Whatever it was, I wasn't going outside. Not tonight. I sat on the bed, my back against the wall, rifle across my lap. The silence stretched on. Hours passed, but I didn't sleep. Every so often, I'd hear a faint rustling outside, but I refused to look. I just waited, gripping the rifle, forcing myself to stay awake. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. The moment I could see outside, I went to the window. Nothing. The trees stood still, the ground undisturbed. But something was off. The air felt heavy, wrong. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something had been out there, and I had no intention of staying to find out what. I packed up my things, throwing everything into my truck as fast as I could. Before leaving, I did one last check around the cabin. When I walked to the back, my stomach dropped. Footprints, human footprints, leading from the woods to the back of the cabin. I didn't stop to think. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove, fast. I didn't look back. I didn't tell my uncle what happened. I didn't tell anyone. But I know what I saw, and I know, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone out there. I remember everything about that weekend at the cabin. The smell of damp wood, the way the cold air crept through the cracks in the walls, the endless silence broken only by the wind scraping tree branches against the roof. It was supposed to be a simple getaway. Just me, a rented cabin deep in the woods, and a few days of peace away from the noise of the city. The drive took longer than I expected. The last 30 miles were on a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my car. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches arching overhead, blocking out the sun. My phone had lost signal an hour earlier, and I hadn't seen another vehicle in at least 50 miles. The isolation felt comforting at first. A break from everything. No distractions, no obligations, just me and the quiet. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how old it looked. The photos online made it seem rustic but well kept. In person, it was different. The wood was faded and cracked, the windows fogged over with dirt. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a set of uneven wooden steps led up to the door. I hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. The air was colder than I expected. The trees around the cabin stood tall and unmoving, their bare branches twisting in the windless sky. There was no sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. I grabbed my bag from the car, walked up the steps, and pushed open the door. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. The furniture was simple. A couch against one wall, a fireplace opposite it, a small kitchen tucked into the corner. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I spent the first hour settling in. I unloaded my bag, checked the cabinets, Found some canned food and a half-empty bottle of whiskey left by the last guest. The water worked, but the pressure was weak, and the pipes groaned when I turned the faucet. There was no cell service, but that was expected. As the sun began to set, I decided to walk the perimeter of the cabin, just to get a feel for the area. The ground was uneven, covered in dead leaves and patches of frost. I found an old, rusted axe leaning against the back wall of the cabin, its blade buried in a stump. A few feet away, a shed sat half-collapsed, its wooden walls buckling under years of neglect. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck. Something about it made me uneasy, so I left it alone. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I sat on the couch, sipping whiskey, listening to the silence. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt wrong, like something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I fell asleep on the couch at some point. When I woke up, the fire had burned low, and the cabin was freezing. Something had woken me, a noise. I sat up, listening. Nothing, just the wind outside. But then I heard it again, a soft, slow creak, like wood bending under weight. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon maybe, but as I listened, the creaking continued. Slow, deliberate, like footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, straining to hear. The noise stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, suddenly, the doorknob rattled. My heart slammed against my ribs. I sat frozen, staring at the door. The knob twisted again, harder this time. Someone was out there. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound. I reached for the fire poker, gripping it tight. The door was locked, but the cabin was old, the wood weak. If someone wanted in, they could force it. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. I stayed there, listening, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. The fire burned lower. My muscles ached from staying so still. Finally, after what felt like forever, I forced myself to stand and creep toward the window. I pulled the curtain back just an inch. The porch was empty. Nothing but darkness beyond the weak glow of the fire inside. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I stepped outside, looking for footprints. The ground was covered in frost, the leaves undisturbed. But the doorknob, it had smudges, as if someone had grabbed it with bare hands. I thought about leaving. I should have, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had rattled the door. Maybe I was imagining things. I had come here to be alone. I wasn't about to let my own paranoia ruin that. But that night, it happened again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just the doorknob. There were noises outside. The sound of something moving through the trees. Slow, careful steps circling the cabin. I turned off the lights and crouched by the window, gripping the fire poker so tightly my knuckles ached. Then a shadow moved. Someone was standing at the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. Just standing, watching. I didn't move, didn't blink. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I stayed up all night again. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag in minutes, grabbed my keys, and threw open the front door, and froze. Footprints, dozens of them, leading up to the porch, circling the cabin, stopping just beneath the windows. And on the door, scratched into the wood, were 4 words: "See you next time." I ran to my car, started the engine, and didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. I just know I'm never going back. I was never a paranoid person. I didn't jump at noises in the dark or let my mind wander to impossible scenarios. But after what happened in that cabin, I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. It started as a simple trip. 3 days alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods, away from people, noise, and responsibility. I had rented the place online, found it through one of those off-the-grid vacation sites. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin with a wraparound porch, a fire pit out front, and nothing but dense trees in every direction. It was perfect. I wanted solitude, and that's exactly what it promised. The drive up was long. The last 20 miles were on a narrow dirt road that twisted through the forest, the kind of path that made you wonder if you had made a wrong turn somewhere. My truck rumbled over loose rocks, the tires occasionally sliding in the deep ruts left by previous vehicles. My cell service had dropped miles back, but I wasn't worried. I had my supplies, food, water, a rifle just in case, and enough firewood to last the weekend. Everything was planned out. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked, checked out the inside of the cabin, and settled in. It was small but cozy. One main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a single bedroom. The wooden walls gave it a rustic feel, and the windows let in just enough light to keep the place from feeling cramped. Outside, the silence was almost unnerving. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. I spent the evening sitting on the porch, drinking a beer, and listening to the forest. It was calming, even with the unsettling quiet. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started noticing something strange. The forest had gone completely silent. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the distant whisper of the wind. At first, I thought maybe a predator was nearby. A wolf, maybe a bear. But I didn't see anything, and after an hour or so, the normal sounds of the forest never returned. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I went inside, locked the door, and told myself I was overthinking it. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, just a soft crunching noise, like footsteps on the dirt path around the cabin. I stayed still, listening, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. Probably an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Not just any footprints, bare human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows. I checked the locks twice after that. The second night was worse. I woke up again, this time to something tapping on the window. Slow, deliberate, a light, rhythmic sound. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't move. The tapping continued for what felt like forever before it finally stopped. Morning came, and I stepped outside, my rifle in hand. The footprints were back, fresh in the damp earth. This time, they led away from the cabin, vanishing into the trees. Someone had been standing there, watching me while I slept. I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to pack up and get out. But the rational part of my mind said I was being paranoid. Maybe some drunk hiker had wandered too far. Maybe some local kids were messing with me. I convinced myself to stay. That was a mistake. The third night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair, gun across my lap, every light on in the cabin. I listened. The hours crawled by. Then, around 3 in the morning, the doorknob rattled. A slow, testing movement. Not the wind. Not an animal. Someone was trying to get in. I stood up, every muscle in my body tense. The rattling stopped, replaced by something worse. A deep, dragging sound along the wooden walls. A slow scrape, as if someone was running their fingers along the outside of the cabin. I gripped my rifle tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited for something else, anything. But the noise never came back. The rest of the night was dead quiet, the kind of silence that felt wrong. At first light, I grabbed my things and left. I didn't care about the refund, didn't care about the supplies I left behind. I got in my truck and drove, tearing down that dirt road faster than I should have. As soon as I had service again, I called the property owner. I told him what happened, told him someone had been outside my cabin every night. He listened quiet, then let out a long sigh. "You're not the first," he said. I felt sick. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't say, just told me he was taking the listing down. I never got an explanation, never found out who or what had been out there. But I know this. Someone was watching me. Someone was waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have left that cabin at all. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I had expected, tucked away deep in the woods, hidden between towering pines and thick underbrush. The wooden structure was old, weathered from years of harsh winters and rainstorms. The roof sagged slightly, and the porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. It wasn't much, but it was supposed to be my home for the next few months. I had rented it out, needing a break from everything. The city, the noise, the stress. I thought some time alone would clear my head. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the silence was unsettling. No car horns, no chatter, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of some unseen bird. It was supposed to be peaceful. I told myself I needed this solitude. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen with outdated appliances, a living room with an old wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom in the back. The furniture was sparse: a sagging couch, a wooden rocking chair, a small dining table with 2 chairs. The walls were bare except for a few dusty shelves and an old clock that had stopped ticking long ago. The floor was uneven in places, the wooden planks warped from years of moisture and neglect. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat by the stove, listening to the crackling of the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, I felt relatively safe. I told myself that the creaks and groans of the cabin were normal. Old houses make noise. The woods make noise. It was all perfectly natural. It wasn't until the second night that I started to feel something was off. I woke up to a sound outside, a soft crunching of leaves, like footsteps. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon scavenging near the porch. But the sound was slow, deliberate, like someone walking, pausing, then walking again. I stayed in bed, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then silence. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, I checked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was damp from last night's rain, and sure enough, there were prints near the porch. But they weren't hoof prints or paw prints. They were footprints, barefoot, human. A chill ran through me. Maybe someone had been out here just passing through. Maybe some drifter or hiker. But why would they be walking around my cabin in the middle of the night? Barefoot? I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the unease. I chopped wood, cleaned up inside, kept myself busy. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I glanced out the window, I expected to see someone standing at the tree line, just watching. But there was never anyone there. That night, I locked the doors and windows. I even moved a chair in front of the door just in case. I kept the fireplace going, the flickering light making shadows dance along the walls. I stayed up late, forcing myself to read, trying to keep my mind occupied. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the sound of something tapping against the window. Light, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. My body went cold. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The tapping continued. I wanted to believe it was a branch, blown by the wind. But I knew better. It was too precise, too controlled. After what felt like hours, the tapping stopped. Silence pressed in around me. I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I checked the window first. There were smudges on the glass, like fingerprints. And outside, in the mud beneath the window, more barefoot prints. I couldn't stay here. That much was clear. This wasn't some harmless animal or wandering traveler. Someone was out here, watching me, playing with me. I packed up what little I had brought and loaded it into my truck. As I turned to lock the cabin door behind me, something caught my eye. On the porch, just outside the door, was a small pile of stones, stacked neatly, deliberately. I never looked back after that. I drove away down that winding dirt road, back to civilization, back to safety. I never told anyone what happened, because I knew how it would sound, like paranoia, like some city guy who got spooked by the woods. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that if I had stayed just one more night, I might not have made it out at all. I took the weekend off to clear my head. Work had been draining, and I needed a break from the city. A friend of mine told me about this cabin deep in the woods, miles from any town. He had stayed there once and said it was the quietest place he had ever been. That was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me, the trees, and the open sky. The drive was long, mostly empty highways and back roads that got narrower the deeper I went into the wilderness. The cabin was far from anything. No gas stations, no convenience stores, just an old dirt road that twisted through the forest. By the time I got there, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing where the cabin stood. It wasn't much to look at. The wood was old and dark, the porch sagged slightly, and the windows were covered in dust. There was a small shed off to the side, probably used for firewood. I parked my car next to the cabin and grabbed my bag. The air was crisp and smelled like pine. No traffic sounds, no hum of distant conversations, just the wind rustling through the branches. Inside, the cabin was basic. A single room with a bed, a small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a fireplace. A door in the back led to a tiny bathroom. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, and barely any phone signal. Perfect. I set my bag down, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch, watching the last bit of sunlight disappear behind the trees. The quiet was almost unnerving at first, but I liked it. That first night, I slept like a rock. The air was cool, the bed was comfortable enough, and the sound of crickets outside lulled me to sleep. I woke up late the next morning, stretched, and stepped outside. The forest was still, too still. I realized I hadn't heard any birds since waking up. No rustling in the underbrush, no distant woodpeckers, just silence. I brushed it off and went about my day. I took a short hike, made some food, and read a book on the porch, but that quiet still nagged at me. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. Small twigs snapping in the distance, the faint crunch of leaves, but every time I looked, there was nothing. That night, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft shuffling sound, like something moving through the leaves. I lay still, listening. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer and rolled over. But as I was drifting back to sleep, there was another sound, closer, something tapping against the porch. I held my breath. It was slow and deliberate, like fingers drumming against the wood. Then silence again. I didn't move for a long time, listening for anything else, but eventually, sleep won out. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints. They led up to the porch, stopped right by the door, and then turned back toward the woods. The air felt colder than before. I spent the day on edge. I didn't hike, didn't read. I just sat there, staring at the trees, feeling watched. By afternoon, I had convinced myself it was just some local messing with me. Maybe a homeless person living out in the woods. That thought made me feel a little better. At least it was a person, not something else. That night, I locked the door and placed a chair under the handle. I had a small hunting knife in my bag, and I kept it within arm's reach as I lay in bed. I told myself it would be fine. Just one more night, and I'd leave in the morning. Sometime past midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the feeling of something being wrong. The room was dark, the fireplace dead, and the air was freezing. My breath came out in visible puffs. Then I heard it, a slow creak, the sound of weight shifting on old wooden floors. Inside the cabin, my heart started pounding. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The sound was close, just a few feet away. I gripped the knife under the blanket, forcing myself to stay calm. Then, another creak, this time near the table. I didn't know how they got in. I didn't care. My only thought was getting out. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, listening to the breathing that wasn't mine. Slow, steady, deliberate. I could feel the presence in the room, the weight of unseen eyes. And then silence. I didn't know if they had left or if they were waiting for me to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to be patient. I counted the seconds, my fingers gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Still nothing. Slowly, carefully, I moved. I slid out of bed, making no noise. My foot touched the floor, and I froze, listening. Nothing. I took another step, moving toward the door. My hands shook as I removed the chair and turned the handle. The door opened with a soft creak. The night outside was black, but I didn't care. I stepped onto the porch and forced myself not to run. The forest loomed around me, empty and silent. I crept toward my car, my breath coming in shaky gasps. The keys were in my pocket. I pulled them out, fingers fumbling. Then I heard it, from inside the cabin. A long, slow exhale. I ran. I yanked the car door open, jumped in, and locked it in one motion. The engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, speeding down that dirt road without looking back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway, miles away from that cabin. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. By the time I reached home, it was morning. I sat in my car for a long time, just breathing, trying to convince myself it was over. But something kept gnawing at me. When I finally got the nerve to check my phone, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A single notification. A photo, sent from an unknown number. It was my cabin door wide open, and inside, just visible in the darkness, was the faint outline of a person, watching. I always hated being alone in the woods. Something about the silence never sat right with me. It wasn't peaceful. It was too still, too empty, like something was waiting. But I still went. It was supposed to be a weekend trip. A friend of mine had a small, rundown cabin out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Appalachian woods. He'd bought it a few years ago, some dirt cheap deal that he'd been excited about. He only ever used it for hunting season. Said it was a good spot, far enough from any town that you never saw another person. I wasn't a hunter, but I needed a break from my life, so when he offered to let me borrow it for a couple of days, I took him up on it. The drive out was long. The roads got worse the deeper into the woods I went. The pavement gave way to gravel, then gravel to dirt. My car wasn't built for off-roading, and I felt every bump and dip in the road. The trees stretched tall on both sides, the bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. I checked my phone. No service. Figures. When I finally got to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. The place was nothing special. Just a small, single-story thing with a slanted roof and faded wooden siding. There was a porch with a couple of old chairs, their paint peeling from years of weather. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The place smelled like old wood and mildew. There was a small kitchen to the left, a living area with a sagging couch and a wood-burning stove. A single hallway led to the bedroom and a tiny bathroom. Everything was basic, functional but just barely. The walls were thin, and I could hear the wind whistling outside. I dropped my bag in the bedroom. The bed was just a mattress on a wooden frame, covered in an old quilt. The window beside it had no curtains, just a clear view of the darkening woods. I turned away from it. Something about staring into the trees made my skin crawl. I spent the first night in silence. No TV, no radio, just the sounds of the cabin settling and the occasional rustling outside. Probably animals. At least that's what I told myself. The first weird thing happened that night. I woke up around 2 a.m., my heart pounding for no reason. The room was dead quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't hear the wind anymore. Just silence. I sat up, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not loud, but deliberate. Crunching over dead leaves, moving just outside the cabin. Slow. Steady. I held my breath. My brain went through the possibilities: deer, a raccoon, maybe a coyote. But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped just below my bedroom window. I stared at the dark glass, my stomach twisting. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Someone was there. I stayed like that for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. Morning came slow. I checked around the cabin, but there was nothing. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was an animal, and I'd let my nerves get the best of me. I spent the day trying to relax. I took a short walk around the property, stayed close to the cabin. The trees felt too tall, too close, like they were swallowing the sky. I didn't like how quiet everything was. No birds, no rustling, just stillness. That night, it happened again. The same time, the same slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, I forced myself to move. I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed and shined it out the window. Nothing. The light cut through the trees, illuminating the twisted branches, the thick undergrowth. But no one was there. I barely slept. The next morning, I was exhausted. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. 2 nights of bad sleep were making me paranoid. That was all. The third night was worse. I had locked the door. I was sure of it. But around midnight, I heard something inside the cabin. A creak of wood. A shift in the air. My stomach dropped. I reached for the flashlight again, my hands shaking. When I turned it on, the beam landed on the bedroom door. It was open. I hadn't left it open. My breathing was too loud. I forced myself to move, to get up, to check the rest of the cabin. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut. Nothing looked out of place. But the air felt wrong. Heavy. Like something had been there. Like something was still watching. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat up with my flashlight in my hand, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. When the sun came up, I packed my things. I didn't care if I looked stupid. I wasn't staying another night. I threw my bag in the car and started down the dirt road, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't relax until I hit pavement, until I saw the first signs of civilization. Only then did the tightness in my chest ease. I don't know what was out there. Maybe a squatter. Maybe some lunatic living in the woods. Maybe just my own paranoia. But I do know one thing. I will never go back to that cabin. And I'll never be alone in the woods again. I drove up the mountain road, watching as the trees swallowed the last hints of civilization behind me. The gravel crunched under my tires, the sound growing louder as I slowed to take a sharp turn. My cabin, my grandfather's cabin, really sat somewhere ahead, tucked deep into the woods, away from everything. I hadn't been here in years, not since I was a kid. But when life in the city got too loud, too heavy, I remembered this place. The air changed as I climbed higher, growing cooler, cleaner. The trees pressed in close, their thick trunks forming a wall on either side of the narrow road. I hadn't seen another car for miles. That was the whole point. Just a weekend, I told myself. A few days to clear my head, to breathe. The cabin appeared suddenly, like it had been waiting for me. The wood was darker than I remembered, the roof sagging slightly at the corners. A thick layer of leaves blanketed the porch. I parked in the clearing and killed the engine. The silence was immediate, almost unnatural after the hum of the car. I grabbed my bag and walked up the steps, testing each one before putting my weight on it. The door groaned as I pushed it open. Dust hung in the air, thick and undisturbed. I ran a hand over the old wooden table, leaving a streak behind. The place was exactly how my grandfather left it. The stone fireplace, the worn-out couch, the tiny kitchen tucked into the corner. A single hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. The air smelled like old wood and something else, something stale. I dropped my bag on the couch and opened a few windows, letting the cool air sweep in. I spent the first hour cleaning, wiping down surfaces, shaking out the blankets, sweeping dust into little piles that never quite disappeared. The work settled my nerves. I told myself I wasn't scared, that I'd grown up in this cabin, that nothing was out here except trees and deer and the occasional bear. But something about the silence felt wrong. I stepped outside as the sun began to set, standing on the porch and looking out at the dense forest. The trees stretched endlessly, shifting shadows as the light faded. The wind stirred the branches, making them whisper against each other. Then I saw it, just for a second, a shape deep in the trees, too tall for an animal, too still to be the wind. My heart thumped hard against my ribs. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, my eyes playing tricks on me, adjusting to the dimming light. I stepped back inside and locked the door. The old bolt slid into place with a heavy click. I checked the windows twice before turning on the lantern. The first night passed in restless sleep. Every creak of the cabin woke me. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the glass panes. I thought I heard footsteps once, crunching outside in the leaves, but I told myself it was an animal. The forest was full of them. Morning came slow and gray. I made coffee on the old stove and stepped onto the porch. The clearing looked different in daylight, less menacing, more familiar. But the feeling in my gut hadn't gone away. I decided to check the perimeter, just to ease my mind. The grass was still damp with morning dew as I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground for tracks. Nothing unusual, no signs of anyone or anything. But then, behind the cabin, I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. Too large, too deep in the soft earth. They led from the tree line to the back window, then stopped. No return trail. I stared at them, my skin crawling. Someone had been here, standing at my window, watching. I rushed inside and locked the door. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was too deep in the mountains for that. I needed to leave. I packed my bag in minutes, shoving everything inside without care. I grabbed my keys, threw open the door, and froze. The footprints were gone. The earth was smooth, undisturbed, like they'd never been there at all. I stepped onto the porch, my breath coming fast. I knew what I saw. I wasn't crazy. I backed toward my car, keys clenched in my fist. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Close, too close. I turned fast, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the empty woods. But the feeling was back, heavy in my chest, that I was being watched. I yanked open the car door and slid inside, shoving the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I turned the key again. Nothing. A third time, the engine groaned, coughed, and fell silent. I gripped the wheel, forcing myself to breathe. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe I flooded the engine. Then I saw them, deep in the trees just beyond the clearing. A figure, standing still, watching me. My blood turned to ice. I tried the key one more time, my hands shaking. The car roared to life. I didn't hesitate. I threw it into reverse, tires kicking up gravel as I spun around. I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, branches scraping against the car. I didn't stop when I hit pavement, didn't breathe until I saw the first signs of town. I checked into a motel that night, double locking the door. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning, I called a tow truck to go back for my car. When they brought it, the driver gave me a strange look. "Saw your cabin while I was up there," he said. "You know someone's been staying there, right?" I stared at him. "What?" "Yeah," he said, scratching his head. Fresh footprints all over the place. And the door was wide open. I never went back. I should have turned back when I saw the gas station attendant shake his head at me. He didn't say a word, just stood there on the wooden porch of that rundown place, watching me as I pumped gas. His eyes told me everything, but I ignored it. I had already paid for the rental, already planned the whole trip, and I wasn't about to back out now. I was going to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods. No work, no emails, no people. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I had dreamed of this kind of solitude for years, and now I finally had it. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The paved road turned to gravel and then to dirt. My car's tires kicked up dust, and the further I went, the less I saw of the sky. The trees grew thicker, pressing in from both sides. The road was barely wide enough for my car, and I had to drive slow to avoid the deep potholes. There was no cell service. That was expected, but seeing the signal disappear made my stomach tighten a little. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to set. The place was small, just one story with a slanted roof, a porch, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was dark, weathered, but still sturdy. There was a shed out back, padlocked. I didn't bother checking it. I had no reason to. I unloaded my stuff, set up the small kitchen, and lit the fireplace. The inside was exactly what I had expected. Basic furniture, old wooden floors, a bed in the corner, and a single bathroom. The windows had thick curtains, and the door had 2 locks. I checked them both twice, not because I was scared, just because it felt right. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. When you spend every day surrounded by the sounds of the city, car horns, sirens, people talking, you forget how loud silence can be. The wind through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling, my own breathing. That was all I heard. I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, some small noise woke me up, a rustle outside, the groan of a tree bending in the wind. I told myself it was nothing. The second day, I explored a little. There was a lake not too far from the cabin, maybe a 15-minute walk through the trees. The water was still, dark, and untouched. No boats, no docks, just nature. I spent the afternoon there, sitting on the shore, enjoying the peace. When I walked back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was open, not wide open, just a few inches, but I knew I had closed it. I knew I had locked it. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't pulled it shut all the way. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. That had to be it. Still, my hands were shaking as I stepped inside. Nothing was out of place. My bags were where I left them. The food was still on the counter. Nothing was missing, but I still felt it. Something was off. That night, I locked the door again. I checked it 3 times. I dragged a chair in front of it just in case, and I barely slept. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to the porch, and then back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. I wasn't crazy. Someone had been here. Someone had walked up to the cabin in the night, and then left. I packed my stuff. I didn't even think about it. I threw everything into my bag and carried it out to the car. The keys were in my pocket. I was ready to go. The car wouldn't start. It wasn't the battery. The lights came on, the dashboard lit up. But when I turned the key, the engine just clicked. I tried again, and again. Nothing. I sat there for a while, gripping the wheel, forcing myself to breathe. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be. But it was. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch. My mind was racing. I had no way of calling for help. No way of leaving. I told myself I would wait until morning, hike back down the road, and find someone, anyone. That was the plan. But that night, I heard them. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Moving outside the cabin. Someone was out there, just beyond the walls. I could hear the leaves crunching under their weight. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted me to hear them. I sat in the dark, gripping the fireplace poker. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then twice, then silence. I didn't sleep. I waited. Every sound made my heart pound. I watched the door, the windows. I didn't turn on a light. I just waited for morning. As soon as the sun came up, I left. I grabbed my bag, a bottle of water, and started walking. I didn't look back. I just walked. The road felt longer than before. The trees felt closer. Every sound made me flinch. I walked for hours. My legs ached. My throat was dry, but I didn't stop. And then, just when I thought I would never reach the main road, I saw it. A truck, parked near the gas station. A man was standing next to it, smoking. I ran to him, out of breath, my words a mess. He didn't say anything at first, just listened. Then he nodded once, like he had heard it all before. "You're lucky," he finally said. "Some folks don't make it out." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I never went back for my car, never looked up the cabin again. Whatever was out there, whoever was watching me, I wasn't going to give them a second chance. I don't know if I'll ever sleep right again. It's been a week since I left that cabin, and I still can't shake the feeling that I left something unfinished. Or maybe something unfinished is still waiting for me. I had rented the place for a few days, hoping for some quiet. Work had drained me. City noise had started to wear on my nerves, and I needed to clear my head. A buddy of mine told me about this cabin up in the mountains. It was far from the nearest town, deep enough in the woods that I wouldn't hear anything but nature. Sounded perfect. Just me, some books, and the stillness of the wilderness. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the peaks. The drive up was rough. The road was more of a dirt path, full of potholes and lined with thick trees that seemed to lean in too close. By the time I reached the cabin, my car was coated in dust. The cabin itself looked sturdy, made of old, weathered wood. It was small but had everything I needed: a bed, a kitchenette, a fireplace, and a tiny bathroom. There was a deck out back overlooking a sloping patch of forest. No neighbors, no roads in sight, just trees stretching out in every direction. That first night was peaceful. I sat on the deck with a beer, listening to the crickets. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I turned in early, feeling the kind of deep exhaustion that only fresh air brings. But sometime in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me, not exactly. More like a shift, a feeling that something had changed. I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, my ears straining. The forest outside was silent, too silent. No crickets, no wind, just dead air. I sat up, my skin prickling. I reached for my phone, but there was no service. I hadn't expected much signal this far out, but something about being completely cut off in that moment unsettled me. I got up and walked to the window. The moon was bright, casting silver light over the trees. Everything looked normal, but that silence, it was wrong. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I forced myself to shake off the weird feeling. I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to explore a little. I found a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, their branches tangled like fingers. The air was cool under the canopy, but there was a damp, rotten smell that I couldn't place. About half a mile in, I found something strange. A clearing with a pile of old, rusted tools. An axe head without a handle, a saw with broken teeth, a hammer so rusted it looked like it had been sitting there for years. But there were no signs of a cabin, no remnants of a structure. Just tools, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I felt a chill creep up my spine. There was something wrong with the place. The way the trees seemed to lean inward, the way the silence felt too thick. I turned back, walking faster than I meant to. By the time I reached the cabin, my heart was hammering. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to read, but I couldn't focus. Every little noise made me jump. By evening, the silence had returned. The same suffocating quiet. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see something moving in the trees. But there was nothing, just stillness. That night, I woke again. This time, it was a sound, faint, barely there. A soft scraping, like something dragging against wood. I held my breath, listening. Came again from outside, from the deck. I grabbed the flashlight by my bed and clicked it on. The beam shone weakly through the window, illuminating the deck. Nothing. I hesitated, then slowly made my way to the door. I pressed my ear against it, heart pounding. The sound had stopped. I counted to 10, then cracked the door open, shining my light outside. The deck was empty. The forest beyond was black, the trees like shadows against shadows. But then I saw it. Faint scratches on the wooden planks. Fresh. They hadn't been there before. I locked the door and sat up the rest of the night, every nerve on edge. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed my things, loaded up the car, and got the hell out. As I pulled onto the dirt path, I glanced at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw them. Footprints. leading from the trees to the deck. Bare footprints pressed into the damp earth. I drove faster, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back where I could see other cars and hear the normal sounds of the world. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know, but I can still feel it. That silence, that waiting, like something unfinished, still lingering in the trees, watching, listening, and maybe, just maybe, still waiting for me to come back.